This episode is sponsored by Honeybadger. Are you looking to enhance clarity in production without a PhD in observability? Try Honeybadger Insights. Honeybadger Insights is built around structured events and Honeybadger's new query language BadgerQL, which allows you to analyze data, create metrics, and design custom dashboards. All of this is available for free with Honeybadger's monitoring suite, which includes error tracking, uptime monitoring, and more. Explore your data in new ways with BadgerQL. It's pretty cool and simple. So give it a try today at honeybadger.io. That's honeybadger.io. In this episode, we're going to be looking at deploying with Kamal on a DigitalOcean droplet. And I know I've covered this episode before, and it's also something that I covered back when it was Maersk, but recently Kamal 2.0 was released, and it's now up to Kamal 2.1. And with that came a lot of additional things, as well as an updated documentation, which I think has been really improved. And one of the new things about it that I really like is one, you're able to have multiple applications deployed to the same server, but then also we got the proxy. And the proxy basically replaces traffic, and it's really the intermediary between our Rails application server, which most often is Puma, and a load balancer or just directly to the web. And one of the nice things about this is that it also will provide an SSL certificate right out of the box. And so in this episode, I do want to look at a fresh deployment on a Rails application with Kamal, and then also some of the nuances that I found with it. And once we get our application deployed, we'll then start taking a dive in to see what Thruster is, and how some of the new features of Rails 8 plays well along with Kamal. And so I'm going to create a DigitalOcean droplet, and it's just going to be a standard droplet. And for the purposes of this episode, I'm not going to pick a big one, but I am going to choose Debian over Ubuntu simply because Debian is a bit slower for new features, but it is more stable in my opinion. I'll then choose a droplet size. I don't need a really large instance, so I'm just going to pick one with 2 CPUs and 2 gigabytes of RAM. And that is something that you do want to take note of as you are doing this, because when you are deploying with Kamal, if your application is already up and running, when you go to deploy, it will spin up another Docker container with your new application. So for a brief period of time, you'll have both applications running. So you do want to leave a little bit of headroom to make sure that you don't run out of system memory. I'm not going to worry about the additional storage or the backup plans. I do have an SSH key already set up, so I'll go ahead and use that. And that's really all I need to do. So I'll go ahead and create this droplet, and I'll wait for it to provision. And you're going to be able to do these steps whether you're using DigitalOcean, an EC2 instance, your own hardware, or some cloud hardware like you would get with Hetzner or Linode. And so for now, I am going to copy this IP address because this is the endpoint that we'll be hitting. And for the purposes of this episode, I am going to use one of my domains that I have, talkrails.com, and I'm just going to add a new record, and maybe we want to give it the subdomain app, and then I'm just going to put in the IP address. We can leave the proxy status as enabled, or we can disable it. If we disable it, then we're not going to have an SSL certificate, but luckily, with the Kamal proxy, it's going to issue one for us automatically. So you will be able to use a Cloudflare proxy if you want to, but initially for this demonstration, I'm going to leave it disabled, and we'll look to see if we're able to get an SSL certificate assigned from Let's Encrypt through Kamal proxy. And so to get started, I am going to generate a new Rails application, but I am going to be using Rails 8 Beta because it does have a lot of the stuff set up for us that we will need. You can go ahead and install Beta with the gem install Rails --pre, and that'll install the latest version. So we'll then go ahead and create our new Rails application. And I am going to use SQLite for this example, but typically I don't like using SQLite even for a production instance. And I've discussed this already in the past, but it's really just out of fear, where there has been some cases where databases have gotten corrupted or some concurrency issues. But regardless, I've also used it in many cases, and it's been just fine. So your mileage may vary. And so now that we have a fresh Rails 8 application set up, I'm going to come under the config and I'm going to go into the deploy.yml. The first thing that I need to do is update this web server. So I'm going to put in the IP address of our DigitalOcean droplet. We also need to give it an app name. So I'm just going to call it app1, for example. And then we need to give it the username for the Docker Hub registry. And then also we need to give it our image name. Now under the proxy, if we are wanting to have the SSL certificate issued, then we do need to set this to true, which in our case, we do want that to happen. And then I just need to update this with our domain name, which is the app.talkrails.com. If I wanted to, we could also have another one, and you would just separate it by a comma. We can then come down under the registry, and I'm just going to put in my username for the registry, and then everything else, I'm just going to leave as the default, and we will go through and explain some of this in a little bit. So I'm going to save this, and then in my terminal, I'm just going to SSH into that box with our root account, and then I'll verify the connection, and I'm able to connect to it. So without doing anything else, I'm just going to exit out of there. And with a fresh Rails 8 application, Kamal is already installed. So we can run the Kamal command, and we'll see everything that we're able to do. And in my case, I want to go ahead and run the Kamal setup. That's going to install everything with the accessories, pushing our environment variables, and deploying the application to the server. So that's going to take a little bit to do. It's going to install Docker if Docker doesn't exist and do everything that we want it to do. I am going to go ahead and SSH into that machine and run watch-n1 docker container ls just so we can see that right now we don't have the Docker daemon, and now we do. And now it's going through and building our image. And once it's done building the image, it's then going to push it up. It's then going to pull it down. And now we can see stuff happening at the top. Right now we have the Kamal proxy installed, and it's also installing our web application or starting up that container. And it looks like everything is done. So if that's all done, I should be able to just exit out of here. And then we can try visiting this endpoint. Come into that web address. We now have it up and running and it's live. So that's really awesome. But let's make it a little bit more complicated. So we have our application up and running, and now we want to make some changes. Let's go ahead and generate a scaffold. So I'm going to generate a scaffold for our posts. And before we do that, let's even make this a little bit more complicated, where I want to run the action_text:install. And we're going to use ActionText on this build. So we have ActionText installed, and then I'm going to generate a scaffold for our posts, and our posts will have a title, and we'll also have some content, and that content is going to be rich_text, which just means that it's going to use the action text for that content attribute. We'll go ahead and run this migration, and then I'll run the Rails DB migrate to migrate the database. With the database migrated, the last thing I want to do is to just come under the layouts, and in my template, I have a navigation links, which I can just add another entry here for our posts. And then I think we're pretty much good to go. So I'm going to just go ahead and commit everything with a git commit, and I'll just say that we added posts. Once that's done, I can run the Kamal deploy, and now it's going to rebuild the Docker image, which should go a little bit faster this time because it already has a lot of the other stuff from a previous deployment. But once it's done building, it's going to go through the same process, and this time it's going to spin up another Docker container while the other one is running. It's going to make sure that it's healthy. It's also going to run any migrations, and then it'll spin down the old one once this one is up and running. And so you can see that took just about 1 minute to do, and it's done. So let's go ahead and come back to our application. You'll see that we don't have our posts yet, so I'll refresh, and now we have our posts. So we can go to our post, we'll create a new post. Everything looks like it's working. So I'll go ahead and just create a test, and it works. So let's go ahead and try this, adding an image. So I'll just take an image, we'll edit this post, I'll paste it in. That looks like it works. We can then update it, and now we see that the active storage bit is working as well. We can verify this by refreshing the page, and that works. So now let's make it a little bit more complicated again. Under the post model, I'm just going to add one line, and it is broadcasts. So that means that anyone who is subscribed to a channel for the post will then get updates. we can come under the view, and under the posts on the show page, we can add an ERB tag for the turbo stream from, and then our post. And so that's all we're going to do for this one. So I'll go ahead and git commit. We'll add this in. I'll give it a git commit message, and then we'll run the Kamal deploy again. This again will take about a minute. In some instances, I have seen it go as few as 20 seconds, and that's when there hasn't been any kind of asset changes or anything like that, which the last deployment we did because we added tricks and ActionText, but this time we don't have that. However, there is still some networking overhead, and also the health checkpoints that have to happen. But you see that on this machine, it did build it in about 27 seconds, which I am on a Mac using the Apple Silicon, and this is being deployed to an x86 environment. So it is having to use Rosetta as the translation layer. I have seen this down as low as 20 seconds on my other desktop machine, but in this case, you see that still happened really fast. So we'll come back, we'll refresh the page, make sure everything still works, and this time I'm going to split it. So I have the same application up and running on both sides, and I'm going to edit this post, and I'll just update the title, and we'll update it, and then we see it updated on the right-hand side. However, now we got a broken image, and that's a little bit strange. If we were to refresh the page, you'll see that the image works, and if I were to refresh this page, the image does work. If I were to come and take another image, so I'll just copy this. So instead of this post created successfully, we now have this editing post image. We'll update it, and again, it's still broken. So that's a little bit strange on why it's doing that. However, there is a reason. So if we right click on this, and I'm just going to open the image in a new tab, you'll see that it was a 404 not found because it's going to the example.org instead of our application website. And so I don't know the proper solution for this, but I do know a workaround that I found that does work. So in our production.rb, I'm going to come up here and do the rails.application.routes and then the default URL options, which is a little bit strange because within this production.rb file, we already do have the default URL options, but it's only for the action mailer. But by setting it for the routes, we can then set it with our host, and our host is going to be the app.talkrails.com. We can even set a protocol, and we want to set it to HTTPS, and that's all we have to do. So I'm going to git commit this again with the fixed production broadcast, and then we'll run the Kamal deploy. Again, I sped this up off camera, but this took about 50 seconds to deploy. So we'll come back, we'll refresh the pages, and then we'll update this again. So I'll just give it some different text. I'll cut this image out, and let's just take this update post image, and we'll paste it in, and we'll now update it. And now you'll see that it broadcasted successfully. And in the last episode, I did cover solid queue, but let's go ahead and just generate a little job just so we can make sure that solid queue is working. So I'm going to generate a job, and I'm just going to call it update the post title. It's going to be a very dumb job where we're just going to take a post. I'm going to grab a sample one. We'll set the post title is equal to just some random string, and then we'll call the post.save. So this is a job that we'll run, and we're going to run it with a recurring job. I only want this to happen on the production environment, so we will use the key production, but then in there, we'll have a random title. We're going to call that class. We'll queue it up in the background. We don't need any arguments, and we'll schedule it for every 10 seconds. So I'll add everything again. We'll git commit with the message, and then we'll run the Kamal deploy again. So if everything is working, then we should just be able to sit here on our post, and every 10 seconds, it should then start updating the title. And so it looks like it's almost done deploying, and it should be done now. So I'm just going to leave the browser up, and after about 10 seconds, we should see that title update. And there it goes. So that's really cool. And we didn't have to do anything to get this working. We just had to create our job and just start using it, especially with that recurring. And again, it changed again every 10 seconds. If we find that this isn't happening often enough, we can even go down to every 1 second, and then we can deploy this as well, and then we'll see it happen much sooner. And so Kamal is really awesome because we get seamless deployments we're able to have multiple applications deploy, which is really as simple as coming into your config deploy, and you would just set a different service name. This does need to be unique for the servers that you're deploying to. So if you're deploying multiple applications to the same server, then you would want to make sure that one, you had enough memory on that server as well as resources, but then also you're giving each application its own name. And so it looks like the deployment again is almost done. So I'll just bring this over and we should see this post title update every 1 second after the deployment is done. And so now you can see that it's updating much faster, and that really isn't a shocker because Rails just works. There's so much included now with Rails 8 that lowers the barrier to entry in doing some what would otherwise be some rather complicated tasks. We didn't have to set up our server to run background jobs or anything. The broadcasting over Action Cable works. We got rich text, and we fixed that broadcast of the images, and it's overall just so easy to work with. But the reality is that it's not always going to be that simple, and you will run into problems, especially if you're upgrading a Kamal 1 application to Kamal 2. And before we dive into that, I just want to take a look at this connection secure to see that we did get a valid SSL certificate from Let's Encrypt. So all of that is working as we would expect. Again, we could come under Cloudflare, and if we were to enable the proxy, then we're going to use the Cloudflare provided SSL certificate. There is some propagation time for that to happen, but over time, if we were to refresh and then check again, it is still using that certificate, but it would switch over to a Cloudflare provided one. And so you don't have to use Cloudflare proxy in front of here if you don't want to, but if you do want that CDN caching part, then you will need to use the proxy. So in my applications, I probably will still use the proxy just because I do want the benefit of the CDN. And there's also a lot of other features that Cloudflare offers that is really good, as far as the web application firewall stuff goes, and just a lot of other features. But we'll leave that alone for now because I really want to take a dive into the Rails application. So one thing I love doing whenever there is another major Rails application update is coming to railsdiff.org. It basically creates two separate applications, a Rails 7.2.1 application and then a Rails 8 Beta 1. You can always change this to whatever you want. If this is the application I was coming from and I'm targeting Rails 8 Beta, I can view the diff to see all of the different changes from a fresh Rails 7 application versus a fresh Rails 8 application. And I would actually take the time to go through and update my application to all of these different changes. Of course, I would look at some of them and make my own decision whether or not I need to update them. For example, if I already have an icon or if I have custom error pages, then I wouldn't want to update those. But things like the environment files and the gem file are going to be some of the big different changes. So in Rails 8, we are basically getting rid of Redis because now Solid Cache can do database level caching, our queue. We're going to be able to handle our queue for background workers within our database. And for Solid Cable, we're no longer relying on Redis to be part of our backend for broadcasting over the WebSockets. And so then we come down to the interesting bits with Kamal and Thruster. And it can be a bit confusing on why do you even need Thruster. And it's really going to be adding that caching or compression layer, as well as the xsend file, which is basically going to handle sending any kind of static files from your application much better instead of tying up a Puma thread. And so this all kind of starts out in the Dockerfile. This Dockerfile, as it even states in the comments, it's used for production, not development. And so a lot of this stuff is going to be dependent on your application, but the defaults are really good. They are pretty secure, even going as far as not using the root user. It's setting up its own user within the Docker container. But then we get down to the really important 3 lines. That's an entry point, expose, and command. So our Docker entry point, when we build our container, it's not going to run this. And we can even see what this is under the bin folder, Docker entry point. It's a simple bash script, which it's checking to see if the jmalloc is installed. And if it is, then it's going to load that. But then it's going to run the binrails db prepare. But in the previous episode in SolidQ, I covered why running db prepare was so important versus migrate, especially on servers where you're upgrading with solid cache, solid queue, or solid cable. And then it calls the exec, and then it's interpolating in the @ symbol. And that basically means that it's then going to defer to the command to run the rest. So thrust is part of thruster, and by default, it's going to listen on port 80. So this is kind of our proxy for this Docker container. We're then going to run our binrail server as we normally would. So this is still going to listen on port 3000. However, the entry point into our Docker container is going to go through port 80, which is going to go through thrust. Then thrust is then going to send that traffic over to port 3000 to the Rails server. And that all happens internally within that Docker container. So if you are upgrading your application from Kamal 1 to Kamal 2, I do recommend that you first come into your entry point and you update this, because within this entry point, you will need this line. You do already have one similar to this, except bin rails and server are not the first and second parameters anymore, because now we do have thrust at the beginning. So you would want to update your Docker entry point. You then want to change your expose to port 80, because if you're going to be using bin thrust, then you'll want to make sure that you're exposing the correct port. Otherwise, if you leave this at port 3000, then you'll end up just serving from the Puma server. And that could be okay for a period of time, but you could also run into situations where a Puma thread is getting locked up because you're sending a large file or something. So if you did add thruster into your gem file, then you would also want to run the bundle bin stub and thruster. That will create the bin thrust file, which that simply just loads in thruster and allows us to use it. We can then look at the Kamal commands. So if you are running 2.1, then you can run the Kamal upgrade command. And all that's going to do is going to take down your old traffic server, and it's going to then replace it with the Kamal proxy one. If you find that things are not working right, then you are able to reverse this migration by installing Kamal version 1.9, and then there should be a downgrade command, which will then remove Kamal proxy and then replace it with the traffic again. And also, as you are making the adjustments within your deploy.yml file when you're upgrading, you won't have this proxy. So you'll want to make sure that you add this in here. And the other thing that I found that also changed was, in before, we had a local that you could specify your architecture. And this doesn't work in Kamal 2. We could even check this with the command Kamal config, and it'll show us that we have an error. So if we fix that, we then run Kamal config again, and then it just displays out the config. And so Kamal 2 is really awesome. I'm now using it on all of my new projects, and even my existing projects, there's 4 of them that I actively maintain, are also been through the process of upgrading to Kamal 2. And some of these applications started out on Rails 4, and I've kept them up to date over the years. Others are still on Rails 7, because I am waiting for the official release of Rails 8, but just going through some of these steps of upgrading Kamal 2, I was able to successfully deploy my Rails 7 applications with Kamal 2. Well, that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. For more videos, check out driftandruby.com.